And so I think we're in a situation because of the limitations of Chinese strategic thinking. So when China built the Belt and Road Initiative, which was proper, which was a good strategy of trying to secure resource independence from the United States, the problem was that when these Chinese ships went to collect commodities from overseas, they were escorted by the U.S. Navy. When they came back, they were escorted by the U.S. Navy. It was the U.S. Navy that guaranteed the protection of Chinese trade. And it never occurred to Chinese policymakers that one day, one of these days, America could be like, why don't we just steal the cargo? You know? Why are we escorting these Chinese ships around the world? Why don't we steal it? And so it never really occurred to Chinese policymakers of this possibility. And I don't know why this is the case, but we can go into many possibilities. But the reality is that China is now in a lot of trouble, where China has invested $200 billion into the Middle East in infrastructure. China right now imports 50 to 6% of its oil needs from the Middle East. Now that the Strait of Hormuz has been closed off, now that this war is raging in the Middle East, China is in a lot of trouble. And again, this is all has to do with the limitations of Chinese strategic thinking. And so now China is in a lot of trouble. And in the short term, China has absolutely no choice at all, but to agree to Trump's demands, which is that China will become a major purchaser of American LNG. China has absolutely no choice in the matter. Okay, absolutely no choice. There's nothing China can do. In the mid and long term, what's going to happen is that Russia will start to challenge America in the seas. It's going to challenge American maritime naval supremacy. Basically, what Russia's going to do is it's going to arm its shadow fleet. And there's no way that Russia could defeat America militarily in the seas. But America will be forced to fight a war of attrition. And over time, the American Navy will be downgraded. It will be degraded. And it'll be very hard for the American Navy to replenish its lost ships. And so that's what we're seeing in the long term. But in the short term, there's absolutely nothing Russia and China can do.
Yeah, I often think about the current situation. It resembles a little bit like before World War I. That is, you saw Germany building and becoming stronger and stronger in terms of industrial production, steel production, essentially all the key measurements. Meanwhile, the British controlled the seas. Their ability to actually compete against the British was, was in the hands of the British. So all they had to do is begin to cut off or threaten their supply lines, which is why the Germans also had to find, other possible corridors, either land or sea. But it's a little bit with the Chinese, I feel. They have all this, well, probably one of the motivations behind the Belt and Road Initiative, that is, you can't rival the US as the leading economy, while the Americans are then organizing their, or organizing their supply lines and their physical transportation corridors. It doesn't make much sense. But this return to, I guess, piracy, as you say, or choking off these different transportation corridors. We've seen, of course, the blockade on Venezuela, Cuba, the hijacking of these Russian ships. By the way, the hijacking of Iranian tankers have happened for some years now before this war as well. So I get it that our hegemon in decline will begin to weaponize all the economic levers of power. That is access to its technologies and industries, transportation corridors, banks, currencies. All of this is weaponized. But the United States isn't all powerful either. I mean, what is the main challenge for the US to hold out? Because, as you said, they're struggling with their own debt. This is all their economic trouble is also translating into social and political instability. So it looks as if they can't afford to play this game with the Iranians for too long. That at some point they will have to put an end to this thing.
I think like the goal is to have this war continue for as long as possible. And the reason why is that if there were peace in the Middle East, what would happen is that Russia, Iran, and China would get together and form a trade alliance to counter America's control over the seas. And this trade alliance could extend easily into Europe, into Africa. this is what McKenna calls the heartland thesis, right? Where America and Britain, the way for them to maintain their empire is by controlling maritime navigation. And the great concern is that a power would emerge in Eurasia to unite the heartland and basically negate Anglo-American naval power. And so this war in Iran cannot stop. If it stops, then Russia could achieve its north-south trade corridor, and China could implement its Belt and Road Initiative. And given the how America is starting to behave, then I think that Europe, the Middle East, Africa would happily join this trade alliance and basically try to ignore the Western Hemisphere and Britain. And so there's no way that that America will cede Iran and leave Iran alone. It's going to send in ground troops to create as much chaos as possible and try to disrupt the Belt and Road Initiative. So what we're seeing is that the Israelis and Americans are targeting railways in Iran, which is crucial to the Belt and Road Initiative. And so we can expect maybe mowing the lawn of Belt and Road infrastructure for years and years.
Yeah, I couldn't help but to notice the targeting of the railroads as well as some ports in the Caspian. So this
That's
entire
right.
international north-south transportation corridor from which have been building from Russia, Iran to India. This is being undermined, but also, of course, Iran's connectivity with China. So, um, but I'm just wondering about the feasibility here because uh, what exactly can boots on the ground achieve, but also can the United States get the boots on the ground because they're quite overextended already.
Right. So the boots on the ground, it's basically to maintain the war, right? So the problem with with air warfare, which is what the Americans and Israelis have been using for the past 6 weeks, is that it's gonna be very hard to maintain your air power. We're already seeing some planes crashing because they're not well maintained. We're seeing the Iranians adapt very creatively and resiliently to American air power. So you can only establish air supremacy by having boots on the ground. And so I think the main objective of the boots on the ground is not necessarily to take over Iran. I mean, that's a suicide mission, but it's basically to secure the coastline and try to degrade Iran's air defenses and basically force Iran on the defensive. The main objective, I think, if I'm fighting this war, I think my main objective is to choke off Tehran, basically to cut off all railways, cut off all roads, and basically force the population into starvation.
So this is where you think we're going?
I think so.
Destroying the population, or as Trump would say, kill off a civilization?
That's right. That would be the strategy moving forward. Yes, to basically besiege Tehran.
It's just such a big country. It seems hard to, yeah, again, if the railroads are undermined. Um, but it also has its domestic problems, though, that Trump needs to, it's not a popular war among the public, and it has some fierce political opposition, only intensified with the political polarization. I did want to ask about NATO, though, because this is was often perplexing to many Europeans because while in the Gulf states they're now discussing the extent to which the being frontline states for the U.S. is actually harmful to the security. They're having some of these talks in East Asia as well. But in Europe, I mean, they must be the most loyal, obedient allies or frontline states of the United States. I'm convinced they would have possibly joined the war on Iran if you would have asked them before it went south. But why does it seem to be such an objective for Trump to, I guess, undermine NATO? Because this is the main. I mean, the Europeans don't have much political imagination to have security without the United States. So, it looks like a massive resource to have the Europeans essentially buy whatever America wants to use their currency, buy their energy, buy their expensive weapons. I mean, the Europeans will do anything if they believe America will be there for them. So why make this big show out of we're not going to be there for you anymore? Because if there's one thing that would make the Europeans break off and seek an independent path from the United States, it's essentially the US has to shut the door on them because they're not, otherwise they wouldn't shut the door on America. So it's a bit strange how I can understand that NATO's not, that the Europeans, they're not really a force amplifier. They're not bringing much to the table. They're a bit of a cost, but still, it's a bit, yeah, strange how dismissive he is of them, though.
So I think that the real war is actually not between the United States and Iran. I mean, the real war is between the globalists and the nationalists, right? So in the United States, it'd be a war between the financial elite, as represented by the city of London and Wall Street, versus MAGA and America First. And so what Trump wants to do is basically transition America from an empire into something called a technate, which is the idea of a greater North America, right? So move away from the world and just focus on consolidating greater North America, taking over Canada, taking over Greenland, taking over Mexico, taking over Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia, Honduras, Nicaragua. Okay, so these countries that Trump has been pissing off for the past few months. Okay, but the grand vision is to transition America into greater North America and become a continental fortress that sells resources to the rest of the world because the rest of the world is at war and is in desperate need of both fertilizer and energy. And so Trump really sees NATO as part of the deep state, as part of the globalist class. And so he's using this war as a pretext to sever relations with NATO. Basically, Trump would be perfectly happy if NATO were to go into Ukraine and be absolutely massacred by the Russians. That would solve a major headache of his. So yes, there is this war going on between the United States and Iran, but we have to forget that we should not forget there's also a shadow war going on between the globalists and the nationalists in America. This is also why Washington, D.C. is supportive of Trump's war, because the globalists want Iran to be humbled. They want Iran to be destroyed so that they can extend the hegemony of the empire. And they think that Trump is a useful idiot, a puppet, in order to achieve this goal. And that's why the Democrats have not stopped him. You know, there was recently, 2 weeks ago, No Kings protests in the United States, millions of people. And like, you were allowed to say no kings, but you were not allowed to say no war, right? You would think like that people would be much more governized by an anti-war settlement than they are by like an anti-tyrant settlement. But during the protests, which were organized by Democratic lobby groups, which were very pro-Zionist, you are not allowed to voice any anti-war settlement. So it just goes to show you that all of Washington, D.C. is fully behind this war, and they think that Trump will be the scapegoat. That even if this war goes badly, Trump will be the one that takes all the blame. The Republicans will be wiped out in the midterms, and then Democrats can steamroll back in office in 2028, and then they can implement a globalist agenda and destroy MAGA once and for all.
Yeah, this language, though, the globalists versus the nationalists, it's fascinating that the first time I read about this divide was by Samuel Huntington, none other. Back in 2004, he wrote this article, Dead Souls, where he was making the point that all this globalization had essentially created a political elite detached from the nation. So he was making the prediction that the future divisions in the world would be between the cosmopolitans or globalists versus the nationalists or patriots. So I thought it was insightful. Again, it's 2004. Yeah, it's been 22 years. And if you listen to a lot of the new populist leaders we have, this is what they're, Marine Le Pen to AfD, this is essentially the same language they also use now. Let me just ask a last question, though. How does Russia fit into this? Because all the pieces kind of make sense. I understand the rivalry between the United States, China, the problem of Iran, but Russia is, it's an energy superpower in many ways. It doesn't have to be an opponent of the United States. It's within this rivalry between the cosmopolitans and the nationalists. It belongs to the latter, it seems. So how do you see this impacting the thinking in the United States? But it's a close partner to Iran and China should have had.
Right. Yeah. So right now, the United States' main adversary is not China. It's really Russia because Russia is the only country that has the resources, the political will, and the territorial integrity in order to challenge American hegemony. And so right now, America's major concern is Russia. And this war against Iran is really seen as a way to counter Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Basically, once Russia went into Ukraine, America has absolutely no choice but to attack Iran in order to counter Russia's possible control over the heartland. And so this is going to be the defining struggle for the world for the next 20 years, not between the United States and China, but between Russia and America. And the great question is, where will the world align over the next 20 years? If history is a guide, most countries will start to align with Russia. Because if you go back to the Peloponnesian War, the main aggressor was Athens. And what happened ultimately was that the entire world ultimately aligned against Athens because Athens was seen as the great aggressor. So right now, the great aggressor is America. And we can see that the world, especially Europe, and Iran and China turning to Russia as the great salvation. And what Russia will do is start to challenge America in the seas. Again, I don't think there's any hope that Russia will win against America in the seas. But Russia has absolutely no choice but to start to challenge America.
You've seen the headlines, I'm sure. They flash across your screen with that familiar urgency. China is in deep trouble with the US blockage of the Strait of Hormuz. And my first reaction sitting here with my cup of tea is to just sigh. Not a small sigh, a deep, weary, from the toes sigh. Because here we are again, watching the theater of geopolitics unfold like a badly scripted drama. And everyone is expected to pick a side, feel the panic, and nod along. But let's stop. Let's actually look at what this title is trying to sell us. China is in deep trouble, deep trouble. That phrase is doing a lot of heavy lifting, isn't it? It suggests a nation on its knees, gasping for air, its entire economy crumbling because of one choke point. And the villain of the piece? The United States, blocking the Strait of Hormuz. Now I want you to pause the video in your mind for a second. Imagine the satellite images, imagine the warships, the tense radio chatter. It's dramatic, it's cinematic, but is it plausible? That's the question no one seems to be asking. So let me walk you through what's actually happening here, not as a military expert, not as a politician, but as a woman who has watched these power games for decades. A woman who remembers the oil shocks of the 70s, the tanker wars of the 80s, and every single time someone declared that this time it's different. First, we have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz is. It's that little sliver of water between Oman and Iran, the mouth of the Persian Gulf, about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. But the navigable channel, much smaller, and through that tiny gap flows about 20% of the world's petroleum. 20%. That's not a statistic to sneeze at. For China, which is the world's largest importer of crude oil, something like 40 to 50% of its imported oil passes through that strait. On paper, that sounds like a vulnerability. And the title wants you to believe that vulnerability is a death sentence. But here's where the story gets interesting. Here's where the commentary needs to slow down and ask the awkward questions. The United States blocking the Strait of Hormuz. What does that even mean? Blocking implies a complete shutdown. Warships stopping every tanker, mines in the water. A naval blockade is an act of war. Not a strong diplomatic signal. Not a sanction. War. And if the United States blockades the strait, who are they blockading? Iran or everyone? Because you cannot selectively block oil from going to China without also blocking oil from going to Japan, South Korea, India, and every European nation that depends on Gulf oil. The strait is a global artery. Clog it, and the heart attack is not just Chinese, it's global. So the moment the US Navy attempts such a blockade, you will have every major economy on Earth screaming at Washington. Not just Beijing, Berlin, Tokyo, New Delhi, Seoul. The price of oil would not just rise, it would explode. We're talking $200, $300 a barrel. We're talking gas lines around the block in Los Angeles and London. We're talking a global recession so deep that the 2008 crisis would look like a mild headache. And the American administration that orders that blockade, they would not survive the next election. Their own allies would abandon them. So already, the premise starts to fray. The United States is not a cartoon villain. It is a complex, often contradictory superpower with its own economic vulnerabilities. And an oil blockade in the Persian Gulf hurts the United States too, because the global economy is one giant, interconnected web. You cannot pull one thread without unraveling the whole sweater. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that the impossible happens. Let's say the US does it anyway. Does China just stand there and take it? Does Beijing wring its hands and cry, "Deep trouble"? No, that's not how China operates. China plays the long game. While we in the West are obsessed with the next news cycle, China is thinking in decades. They have been preparing for exactly this scenario for years. Decades even. Let me tell you about the strategic oil reserves. China has been quietly, methodically stockpiling crude oil since the early 2000s. They built massive underground caverns, storage tanks along their coasts. By some estimates, they have enough oil in reserve to last 100 days, maybe more, under a complete cutoff. 100 days. That's 3 months. That's not deep trouble. That's a buffer. A very expensive, carefully constructed buffer. And during those 100 days, what do you think China is doing? Twiddling its thumbs? No. They are unleashing every diplomatic, economic, and military tool they have. First, diplomacy. China has spent the last 2 decades building relationships with every country in the Middle East. They are Iran's biggest trading partner. They have a 25-year strategic agreement with Iran worth $400 billion. You think Iran would just watch the US blockade the Strait and do nothing? Iran has threatened to close the Strait itself many times. In this scenario, the US and Iran would be locked in a standoff, and China would be whispering in Tehran's ear, offering support, intelligence, maybe even naval escorts. Suddenly, it's not a US blockade. It's a US-Iranian confrontation, with China as the power behind the curtain. Second, land routes. People forget that oil doesn't have to travel only by sea. China has been building the Belt and Road Initiative, a massive network of pipelines, railways and highways across Central Asia. There is a pipeline from Kazakhstan to China. There are overland routes from Russia. China is also investing heavily in the port of Gwadar in Pakistan, which sits on the Arabian Sea, outside the Strait of Hormuz. From Gwadar, oil can be trucked or piped overland into western China. It's slower, more expensive, but it works. And in a crisis, expensive is better than nothing. And here, the commentary gets very quiet, because no one wants to talk about what happens when 2 nuclear-armed superpowers stare each other down in the Persian Gulf. China has a navy now. Not the rusting fleet of the 1990s. The People's Liberation Army Navy has aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, and a base in Djibouti, right at the mouth of the Red Sea. If the US blockades Hormuz, China could send its own naval task force to protect its tankers. Would that lead to a shooting war? Possibly, but it's not a given. The US and China have fought proxy wars, cyber wars, trade wars, but not a direct military war, because both sides know that such a war would be catastrophic. Mutually assured destruction doesn't just apply to nuclear weapons, it applies to global trade. So the idea that China is in deep trouble because of a US blockade, it assumes that China is passive, that China has no options, that China will simply accept its fate. That is a very Western, very arrogant assumption. China is not a victim. China is a chess player, and it has been moving its pieces for a very long time. But let me also address the elephant in the room. The title of this video is designed to provoke fear. Fear sells. Fear gets clicks. Fear makes you watch the next video and the next video. China is in deep trouble is a narrative that serves certain interests. It serves those who want to see China as a paper tiger, a giant on shaky legs. It serves those who want to justify a more aggressive American foreign policy. It serves those who want to distract from America's own vulnerabilities, like its aging infrastructure, its political divisions, its own dependence on global supply chains. And here's the ironic twist. If the US really did blockade the Strait of Hormuz, the country in the deepest trouble would not be China, it would be the United States, because a blockade is an act of war against Iran, which would retaliate. It would be an act of economic warfare against every nation that buys Gulf oil. It would shatter the global rules-based order that the US itself created after World War II. It would push China and Russia closer together. It would accelerate the very thing the US claims to want to prevent, a multipolar world where American power is diminished. So no, my dear, I don't think China is in deep trouble. I think China is watching, waiting, and building. I think the real trouble is for anyone who believes that a single choke point, a single military maneuver, can bring down a civilization that has survived for 5,000 years. China has seen empires rise and fall. It has seen nomads invade, dynasties collapse, famines, floods, foreign occupation. A blockade of a strait? That is a Tuesday for Chinese strategists. So as I finish my tea and the video ends, I want you to remember this. Do not confuse drama with reality. Do not confuse a scary headline with a strategic analysis. Let me really settle into this commentary, because 30 minutes is a long time. And the next time someone tells you that a country is in deep trouble, I've only just warmed up. Who benefits from that story? So where were we? And what are they not telling you? China. The so-called Strait of Hormuz is narrow. I want to take human imagination into the Chinese especially mind, the fearful because that's what most of these videos miss entirely. They look at China as if it's just another Western country with a different flag. They think China reacts the way the United States or Britain would react. But China does not think in headlines. China thinks in centuries. Let me tell you a story. A very old story. When the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, unified the country over 2,000 years ago, he didn't just build a wall. He built roads. He standardized the axle widths of carts so that every vehicle could travel on every road. He standardized the writing system. He standardized weights and measures. Why am I telling you this? Because that instinct, that deep, almost genetic drive to plan for continuity, for resilience, for the long haul, is still alive in Beijing today. The Great Wall wasn't built in a panic. It was built over centuries, brick by brick, dynasty by dynasty. And that is exactly how China approaches its energy security. You see, when Western analysts look at the Strait of Hormuz, they see a bottleneck, a vulnerability, a place where a knife can be pressed against China's throat. But when Chinese strategists look at the Strait of Hormuz, they see a problem to be solved. Not with a single dramatic solution, not with a war or a blockade of their own, but with 1,000 small solutions, layered on top of each other, like the bricks of that ancient wall. Let me list some of those bricks for you, because the list is long, and most people have never heard of half of them. First, there is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. This is not just a road. This is a $300 billion project, a network of highways, railways, and pipelines that connect China's western province of Xinjiang to the Arabian Sea at Gwadar port. Now, think about what that means. Gwadar is outside the Strait of Hormuz. It sits on the Gulf of Oman, which opens directly into the Indian Ocean. If the strait is blocked, oil tankers can still dock at Gwadar. Then, that oil is pumped or driven overland into China, bypassing Hormuz entirely. Is it as cheap as shipping directly to Chinese ports? No, but in a crisis, cheap is not the priority. Access is the priority, and China has built that access with its own money, its own labor, its own engineering. That is not the behavior of a nation in deep trouble. That is the behavior of a nation that expects trouble and builds bridges over it before the trouble even arrives. Second, the Myanmar pipelines. Most people forget about this one. China has built 2 parallel pipelines, one for oil and one for natural gas, running from the coast of Myanmar all the way into China's Yunnan province. The oil terminal is at Kyaukpyu, on the Bay of Bengal, again, completely outside the Persian Gulf, again, completely bypassing Hormuz. These pipelines can carry over 20 million tons of crude oil per year. That is not a trivial amount. That is the energy supply for entire provinces, and China built them quietly, without fanfare, while the rest of the world was arguing about democracy and sanctions and human rights. China just kept building. Third, the Russian connection. I know, Russia is a complicated friend, but friendship in geopolitics is not about love. It is about alignment of interests. And right now, Russia and China share a very powerful interest, reducing American influence. The power of Siberia pipeline and its successor Power of Siberia 2 bring Russian natural gas directly into northeastern China. There are also oil pipelines from Russia's Far East, and here is the beautiful irony. The more the United States tries to isolate Russia with sanctions, the closer Russia and China become. The more they trade in their own currencies, the more they build infrastructure that bypasses the old Western-dominated sea lanes. A US blockade of Hormuz would not hurt China alone. It would hurt every oil-importing nation. And Russia, which is a massive oil and gas exporter, would suddenly become the most important energy supplier on the planet. You think Moscow wouldn't love that? You think Moscow wouldn't sell every drop to China at a very friendly price, just to spite Washington? Of course they would. So already, we have 3 major alternative routes. 3 bricks in the wall, and I haven't even mentioned the strategic petroleum reserves I talked about earlier. But let me expand on those reserves, because they are genuinely astonishing. China does not just have 100 days of oil in storage. They have some of the largest underground storage facilities ever built. Huge salt caverns, the size of cathedrals, hollowed out and filled with crude. They have floating storage, tankers anchored off their coasts, full to the brim. They have been buying oil for years, not just for immediate use, but for this exact scenario. A rainy day, a blocked strait, a hostile navy. And the thing about these reserves is that they are not just for China. They are a signal. They say to the world, you cannot starve us. You cannot choke us. We have already eaten. Now let me talk about the Chinese Navy again, because this is where the commentary gets really interesting. The People's Liberation Army Navy, the plan, is not the Navy it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, China had a handful of old Soviet destroyers and some patrol boats. Today, China has the largest navy in the world, by hull count. More than the United States. Now before you get too excited, hull count is not everything. American ships are larger, more advanced, more battle-tested, but the trend is undeniable. China is building blue water warships at a pace that has not been seen since World War II. Aircraft carriers, amphibious assault ships, nuclear submarines, destroyers with advanced radar and missiles. And here is the key. These ships are not just for show. They are designed to operate far from Chinese shores, in the Indian Ocean, in the Persian Gulf, in the Mediterranean. China already has a naval base in Djibouti, on the Horn of Africa. That base is small today, but it is a toehold. And a toehold can become a foothold, and a foothold can become a fortress. So imagine the blockade scenario again. The US Navy tries to stop Chinese tankers at Hormuz. China does not send 1 or 2 frigates. China sends a carrier strike group. They send submarines that the US cannot easily track. They send electronic warfare aircraft to jam American radars. They do not need to win a decisive battle. They only need to make the blockade so costly, so risky, so potentially explosive, that the United States backs down. And here is the thing about the United States. For all its military power, it is a democracy. Democracies are sensitive to casualties. A single sunk American warship, a single pilot lost, and the political pressure to de-escalate becomes overwhelming. China knows this. China has studied the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War. They know that the American public has a limited appetite for blood. China, on the other hand, is not a democracy. Its leaders do not face elections. They can be patient. They can absorb losses. They can wait. That asymmetry is crucial. In any long-term confrontation, patience is a weapon. And China has more patience than any other nation on earth. But let me step back from the military for a moment, because the military is only one piece of the puzzle. The real story here is economic. And the real question is not whether China can survive a blockade. The real question is whether the world can survive a blockade. Because the global economy is not a collection of separate national economies. It is a single, integrated, fragile system. And the Strait of Hormuz is one of its main arteries. Think about Japan. Japan imports almost all of its oil. Most of it comes through Hormuz. If the strait is blocked, Japan's economy collapses within weeks. Factories shut down, power plants go dark. The same is true for South Korea, for India, for much of Europe. These are not enemies of the United States. These are allies. Close allies. Do you really think the Japanese Prime Minister, the South Korean President, the German Chancellor would sit quietly while the United States destroys their economies? Of course not. They would scream. They would threaten. They would send their own warships to break the blockade. They would put unimaginable pressure on Washington to stop. And in the face of that global rebellion, the blockade would crumble. So, the very idea of a US blockade of Hormuz is, forgive my language, nonsense. It is a fantasy of military bloggers and YouTube sensationalists who have never had to run a country, never had to think about supply chains, never had to worry about an election after millions of people lose their jobs. The United States is powerful, yes, but it is not all powerful, and its power depends on a global system that it built and that it now struggles to maintain. A blockade of Hormuz would not just hurt China, it would shatter that system. It would be an act of self-destruction. And this, right here, is why I get so frustrated with videos like the one I am supposedly commenting on. They present a cartoon version of geopolitics, a version where the United States is the sheriff, China is the outlaw, and the Strait of Hormuz is a dusty street where a duel will take place at high noon. But the real world is not a Western movie. The real world is a web. A tangled, messy, interconnected web of trade, finance, diplomacy, and culture. You cannot shoot a hole in that web without the whole thing collapsing around you. Let me tell you one more thing about China. Something that the fearmongers never mention. China is not just an oil importer. China is also the world's largest manufacturer of solar panels, the world's largest producer of electric vehicles, the world's largest investor in renewable energy. China is building wind farms, hydroelectric dams, nuclear power plants at a pace that dwarfs every other country. They are doing this not because they love the environment, although that's a nice bonus. They are doing this because they know that oil is a vulnerability. And they want to be the ones who build the next age. Think about that. While the United States is still debating whether climate change is real, China is building the infrastructure of the future. And that future does not depend on the Strait of Hormuz. That future runs on electricity, on batteries, on hydrogen, on solar rays falling on deserts in western China. So even if the US did blockade the strait, even if all the worst-case scenarios came true, China would not be destroyed. It would be inconvenienced. It would suffer, but it would adapt, and it would accelerate its transition to renewable energy. And in 10 years, 20 years, the strait would be irrelevant, a historical footnote, a place where old tankers once sailed. So no, my dear viewer, China is not in deep trouble. China is in the middle of a long, patient, strategic transformation. And the United States, if it is not careful, is the one in trouble. Not because of any single blockade or military defeat, but because it has forgotten how to think beyond the next election, the next news cycle, the next viral video. It has traded strategy for spectacle, and spectacle, as we all know, is a poor foundation for power. I have been speaking for a while now. My tea is long gone. The video on my screen has ended, replaced by the usual recommendations for more alarmist content. But I'm not going to click on them. I am going to sit here in the quiet and think about what I have said. Because this matters. How we talk about the world matters. If we talk about it as a series of crises, as a never-ending emergency, then we will act in panic. We will make bad decisions. We will stumble from one disaster to the next. But if we talk about it as a complex system, as something that can be understood and managed and shaped, then we have a chance. A small chance, but a chance. And that, more than anything, is what I want to leave you with. Do not let the fearmongers win. Do not let them sell you a story of inevitable decline or inevitable conflict. The strait is not blocked, and China, for all its flaws and all its challenges, is not in deep trouble. It is, as it has always been, adapting, surviving, preparing for the next 1,000 years. Now, if you will excuse me, I need to make another cup of tea.